The subject for this video is rather general. It's fallacies as arguments, and we're going to look at what is a fallacy, because this is an introduction to the entire series on videos which are looking at specific fallacies. So what we're going to cover in this video is we'll talk about what we mean when we use this term fallacy. We'll look at some examples of common fallacies that get made in everyday life. We'll talk about this notion of general argument structure and why it's useful for understanding these bad arguments. Then we'll look at the issue of, is there some sort of standard classification that we should be sticking to for fallacies, or is there some other way of proceeding? We'll talk about how reasoning actually goes wrong, why it is that we fall into these fallacies, and then we'll finish up by hitting on some common situations in which we have to be on our guard and look out for falling into fallacies ourselves in our own argument, our own inferences, our own communication, or having other people make them to us. So, what is a fallacy? So, fallacies are arguments. That's a really important term. They're not just unsupported, erroneous, or false claims that people are making. So if somebody hears you making a false claim and they say that's a fallacy, they're technically not correct about that. You have to be making some sort of argument. Perhaps they're taking you to be making some implicit argument. And just a little bit of review about arguments. Arguments consist in claims, and they have a certain structure in which some claims are being used, those are the premises we call them, to provide reasons why we should believe another claim, the conclusion, to be true. So a fallacy is going to have that sort of structure. It's that sort of thing. And certain recurring types of bad arguments, and this goes way back into early history. This goes all the way back to the beginnings of logic in the West, in Greek thought. There's certain kinds of bad arguments that get made so often and so recurringly that we've come to associate them under particular names. We've picked them out and said, aha, that's that sort of mistake, that's that sort of mistake. And it's interesting because you can see people still making them today. So it's really important for us to learn how to identify them. Now, some fallacies might not be framed as arguments per se. Great example of this is what we call complex question. One example of that would be, have you stopped beating your wife? And if you say this to somebody, what's going on there? You're assuming that they do in fact beat their wife, or they have been beating their wife. This is a classic courtroom example. And you're introducing that as sort of an implicit premise. And so if the person, it's really a false dilemma in a way. If the person answers this way, they lose. If they answer this way, they lose. And it's an argument, but it's framed in terms of a question. Now, we could translate it into the form of an argument. And that's often what we have to do if we want to be very, precise about this sort of thing. Let's think of some examples of fallacies. I think sometimes it's easier to get your head around this sort of notion when you can point at some clear examples that you've run across in your day-to-day life, or in your workplace, or in relationships, in politics, and somebody selling you something, or even mistakes that you yourself have made at some times. So one great example, slippery slope. You'll hear talking heads on TV actually talk about that and use that very term. False dilemma, they also sometimes will say that as well. Now, a slippery slope is a particular kind of fallacy where you say, if you do this small step, that's going to ultimately lead to doing this terrible thing or this terrible outcome here, so you better not start that. And any argument that has that structure, if in fact it's a fallacy, if the little points along the way aren't necessarily true, it's going to be a slippery slope. So having that word to hang it on is very useful. False dilemma, another example, saying either this or that, and you can't pick anything else, when really you could pick something in the middle, or perhaps neither one of them is true. Either you love me or you hate me is an example of a false dilemma. The fallacy of division. has nothing to do with, division in mathematics. It simply has to do with arguments that get made where we start out thinking about some sort of whole that's composed of parts, or, a sum of parts. And we say, because this is true of this, say the team or the building or the human body, the same thing is true of its parts. That can be a fallacy. Straw man, another one that you'll often hear. Straw man is where you take somebody else's argument and you misrepresent it to make it look weaker or crazy or outrageous, and then you make yourself look good by comparison, saying, well, look, you can't possibly believe this, so you must believe my point of view. Ad hominem, you notice the Latin terminology there, that's still used with that one. Ad hominem means an attack on a person. So instead of actually attacking a person's claims, you attack the person who's making the claims, and there's a variety of ways that this can be done. I'm actually going to be doing several different videos for the subdivisions of ad hominem. Begging the question. This can actually mean two different things, but I'll get to that when we actually talk about that in the specific video for begging the question. It has a Latin term, petitio principi, if I remember right. And that's a common thing. You do hear a lot of people using that phrase, that begs the question that, and sometimes they use it rightly and sometimes they use it wrongly, but it is a fallacy. Equivocation. This is a fancy word. It's well worth learning so that you can pop it out when you need it. And when you accuse somebody of equivocating, what you're saying is that they're using the same term, the same word, and they're meaning two different things by it. And it's sort of imperceptibly in the course of the argument changing its meaning. Appeal to pity. There's a whole bunch of different appeals to the emotions. I just picked this one. That's often called the argumentum ad misericordiam, because misericordia is pity or compassion in Latin. And that one is saying, well, because you feel a certain way, you ought to accept this conclusion here. These are all examples of fallacies. We could come up with a lot of other examples, and you'll see a number of videos in this series about specific fallacies that are not on this list. Now, why do I talk about structure? Every fallacy, as a fallacy, has a distinctive structure to it. It's a particular way of arguing, and some of these will be quite similar to each other, but it can be charted out. For many of them, we can actually produce diagrams, and you're going to see me doing that in these videos. I think that some people find them very helpful. I know that my students often do, and I will actually start to produce maybe some worksheets dealing with that as well, but that's a separate topic. We can also chart out, if we're just looking at premises and how the premises lead to the conclusion, we can chart out the general structure of the argument. This is often very helpful to do because many of these fallacies, not everything is above board. Not everything is being made totally explicit. There's often some premises that are at what we call implicit or assumed. And we want to actually make them explicit so we can see the whole argument laid out and figure out whether it's a good argument or not. Now, another question we want to think about is, can we classify fallacies? And we are classifying them by giving them a bunch of different names. There's something that needs to be pointed out in the literature about fallacies. There's no one single agreed upon way to classify or even name the fallacies. It's quite common that somebody will have encountered the fallacies in their English class or their communication class or their critical thinking class or some philosophy class, and they will be looking at the classification from some particular textbook or that some particular professor has given them, and they'll think that this is the way that everybody in the discipline of critical thinking classifies the fallacies. That's not actually the case. There are multiple ways of looking at these. These are complex phenomena. Not everybody calls every single thing by the same name. That also makes things a little confusing. I give you one example of a popular classification of fallacies that organizes them into four groups. One way of thinking about this is that we have fallacies of presumption, where something is being assumed that shouldn't be assumed, that we don't have good evidence for, we don't have good grounds for. Another example, fallacies of relevance, where some premise is being introduced that's not actually relevant to the conclusion. Appeals to emotions would be examples of that. Fallacies of ambiguity, where there's some sort of verbal sleight of hand going on. Equivocation would fit in there. Fallacies of weak or insufficient induction. That's a very fancy word for saying probability or likelihood. False cause would be an example of that. But there's other ways of classifying the fallacies. Some other common ways are talking about structure versus content versus norms of rational discussion. Another way of doing it is to talk about faulty reasoning versus appeals to the audience. There's a number of possible ways to classify these. I don't think we need to be too concerned about that as we're working our way through them. And it's also important to note that sometimes people will call the same fallacy by different names. So, for example, the appeal to popularity can also be called the ad populum, to the people. It can also be called the bandwagon fallacy. Sometimes people cut them up a little bit differently. So some people want to say the genetic fallacy is an example of an ad hominem. I think there's good reasons to say that it's slightly different, but that's a whole different topic there. Now, this leads to the next question about how many fallacies are there? And this is still under the question of classification. So how many fallacies are there? Well, like I put here, that depends very much on which textbook or class or resource you're consulting. So what they say in one textbook may not map exactly onto what they say in another textbook. There is some good news, which is that there is an established discipline of critical thinking. There's a more or less agreed upon core set of fallacies. They may be called by different names, but there's a core set of fallacies which you'll find in most resources. So you can depend on there being some discussion about the appeal to popularity or the appeal to tradition or the shifting the burden of proof or argument from ignorance. There's going to be some continuity and some consistency there. But when we get to the very fringes, the margins, there may be a little bit of play, so to speak. Now, why does our reasoning go wrong? Why do we, in fact, commit fallacies? That's an interesting question, isn't it? And if we understand the thought processes that lead us to committing fallacies, we can understand how other people are going to be led to commit them, and we can put ourselves on guard against temptations to fall into them ourselves. So we want to ask, why are people, and that goes even for critical thinking professors, so easily taken in by fallacies? And we might actually add here, when they're not paying attention, when there's something at stake. One reason is because the fallacies actually are partly correct. They're not totally off base. They build off of some information that's true or right or generally reliable, but then they usually add something else in. So it could be, for example, a red herring fallacy. You might say that you want to get to this conclusion, which is what you want the other person to accept, and you introduce some considerations that are really totally irrelevant to what the conclusion is. That's the red herring. And that information might actually be true. It just doesn't have anything to do with the conclusion. And if you're not paying attention, you might say, oh, well, this part's true, so I guess the whole thing is true. That's a natural human tendency. So this is the second thing, too. There's certain features of human nature that many of the fallacies are going to appeal to. We are emotional beings. So our emotions can be swayed, and like Aristotle points out in his Rhetoric, we don't see things the same way when we're angry as when we're calm, or when we're sad as when we're happy, when we're loving as when we're hating. And some of the fallacies are going to appeal to that. Others are going to appeal to the fact that as human beings, we tend to like things orderly. We tend to like things to be parallel with each other. We also like things to be simpler than they are, and we like to form associations. So we might form associations between things that are not, strictly speaking, relevant to each other, or which don't provide us with good grounds for accepting conclusions. So we need to be on guard against that. And like I put here, being a critical thinker, it's not just a matter of acquiring or having knowledge. There's a lot of people who think that I'll just get myself a critical thinking textbook and I'll learn a few things and now I'll be a critical thinker, or I'll memorize the list of the fallacies. That's really not enough to become a good critical thinker. It's not enough to acquire information. You need to know what to do with the information. So the way that we talk about this in the discipline of critical thinking is that it's a matter of developing key skills, not just having information, but being able to do things with that information, and even dispositions. And when we talk about dispositions, we mean certain, lasting qualities that we've developed that we can count on, what we could call habits, or, some people even call these intellectual virtues. And there's a whole conversation to have there, but I'm not going to get into that now. But I just want to say that if we don't want our reasoning to go wrong, if we want to avoid the fallacies, we need to put in a bit of work. We need to put in a bit of practice. So when should we try to be on guard against these fallacies? Anytime that a person is making a case about something potentially controversial, there's a chance for fallacy to either creep in or be deliberately introduced. And why is this? Well, because we like to win our arguments, and there's nothing in our minds that says we can only make good arguments. Oftentimes we're even seduced by our own bad reasoning into thinking that it's good reasoning. So we need to be on guard a good portion of the time. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to be skeptical all the time or we need to be anxious about this, but we need to be aware. There's certain contexts in which this is more of an issue than in others. Advertising, really prime example there. If you think about the topics that fit into advertising, if you really thought them through, they would be controversial because they're usually making claims that are not true. So they should be controversial. And oftentimes advertising is entertaining, and we like to watch it. But if we're being critical thinkers, we need to be a bit more aware of the claims that are being made. News. There's all sorts of ways that the news can be biased or skewed. Things can be left out. You can even edit things so that it seems like the weaker, you talk about sophism, the weaker argument appears the stronger. Social media, a new thing for, the last 20 years. We now have massive argument wars going on in Facebook and comments on blogs and Twitter, to the extent that we can talk about national discussions or even international discussions taking place through social media. Opinion formation, editorials, op-ed pieces, the talking heads, things that we see on all the different news channels, all of that could fit in. We could add a lot of other things to that too, Comedy Central's, Colbert Report or Jon Stewart's Daily Show. Sometimes they're actually unveiling other people's fallacies. Sometimes they fall into some fallacies of their own, and sometimes it's reflecting their particular point of view. Politics and policy making. There's something about politics, especially in election cycles, that tends to bring out the fallacy writing. Personal decision making, where we can be taken in by our own desires, our own interests into making bad arguments to ourselves or taking other people's bad arguments and buying into them. There's a lot more that could be said about all that, but we'll have videos specifically on these sorts of topics in other playlists. So the last thing I want to talk about, This video is part of a much larger series that's discussing the common fallacies in reasoning and argument, and it belongs to this new channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, reasoning, and argumentation. So if you enjoy this video or you find it helpful for you, share it with other people. Check out all the other videos and the series that are going to be offered in this channel. We're going to be constantly adding new content, and it's going to be a high quality source for improving skills and knowledge in critical thinking.